She walked into the restaurant expecting the world to bow at her feet, until a man from her past reminded her that some doors don't just open because of money. The restaurant had the kind of elegance that whispered money. Not the flashy, in-your-face kind. No chandeliers dripping in excess or menus printed in gold. It was understated. Quiet luxury. The kind that only those who truly belonged recognized. Catherine Langley walked in like she owned the place. In some ways, she believed she did. If not this restaurant, then others like it. Her heels clicked against the polished floors as she barely glanced at the hostess, her gaze sweeping the room instead. A habit. Assessing. Calculating. Deciding who mattered and who didn't. She was dressed in a tailored ivory suit, the silk blouse underneath an intentional shade of off-white, because pure white was too predictable. The diamond studs in her ears weren't oversized, but their clarity was meant to be noticed. She carried herself with the effortless entitlement that came from years of having people cater to her needs without question. The hostess, a young woman with polite but unreadable eyes, smiled. "Good evening, ma'am. Do you have a reservation?" Catherine barely registered the question. "Langley," she said, her tone brisk. "Table by the window." The hostess tapped the name into the system, nodded, and led her across the dining room. The restaurant wasn't full, but it wasn't empty either. Soft conversation hummed over the low jazz playing in the background. Couples enjoying anniversaries, businessmen in quiet discussions. A group of women laughing over cocktails. Catherine slid into her seat, positioning herself with a practiced elegance. The light from the window framed her perfectly, a silent acknowledgement that she belonged in places like this. But just as she settled in, a movement in the corner of the room caught her attention. A waiter approaching, menu in hand. She barely looked at him, but she would remember his face soon enough. "Good evening, ma'am. My name is Daniel, and I'll be taking care of you tonight." The warmth in his voice was natural, effortless, but Catherine barely acknowledged him. Her eyes flicked up just for a second before returning to the menu. "Sparkling water. Cold. No lemon," she said, flipping a page. "And make sure the glass isn't wet from condensation. I hate that." Daniel, standing with perfect posture, nodded slightly. "Of course. Would you like to hear our specials tonight?" Catherine sighed, not bothering to hide her impatience. "Just bring me the list. I don't like when waiters recite them. It takes too long." There was a slight pause. Just a fraction of a second. It was the kind of pause that only someone trained in reading people would catch, the moment where professionalism overrides pride. "Absolutely, ma'am," Daniel replied, his voice even. He placed a small leather-bound list in front of her and took a step back. Catherine didn't thank him. She never did. Not for things like this. She skimmed the options, tapping a perfectly manicured nail against the table. "The filet. Medium rare. No sauce. And make sure it's actually medium rare, not bleeding on the plate." She paused, then glanced at him briefly. "And I'd like someone more experienced handling my order." The words landed harder than she realized. Daniel's hands remained at his sides, fingers relaxed, his face impassive. But something in the air shifted. A few tables away, a woman sipping her wine went still for just a second. A man glancing at his phone looked up. A busboy clearing a nearby table slowed his movements, suddenly aware of the moment unfolding. Daniel remained composed. "We have a highly trained staff, ma'am. Your meal will be prepared and served with the highest standards." Catherine exhaled sharply, closing the menu. "I'd hope so." She picked up her phone, dismissing him entirely. But the conversation wasn't over. Not yet. Daniel turned, walking toward the kitchen with measured steps, his expression unreadable. But the weight of Catherine's words followed him, settling over the room like an invisible fog. A man at the bar shifted in his seat, eyes flicking toward Catherine before looking away. At a corner table, a middle-aged couple exchanged a glance, silently debating whether to say something. Catherine, oblivious to it all, scrolled through her phone with the indifference of someone who had never questioned their place in the world. She didn't notice the hushed whispers or the way the energy in the room had shifted. A few minutes later, Daniel returned, placing a pristine glass of chilled, sparkling water in front of her. The condensation-free surface was a quiet acknowledgement that he had followed her instructions perfectly. Catherine picked it up, took a sip, then set it down with a frown. "This is room temperature." Daniel's voice remained steady. "It's been chilled to the restaurant standard, ma'am." She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "Well, your standard is wrong. Bring me another." Again that slight pause. Daniel nodded once and walked away. At the table nearest to hers, an older man leaned in toward his wife, whispering something under his breath. She nodded, lips pressed into a tight line. The atmosphere had changed, and now Catherine was starting to notice. She glanced up from her phone, catching the subtle tension in the room. The quiet discomfort, the lingering glances. But before she could process it, a new voice cut through the space. "Is there a problem here?" It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, but it carried a weight that made people turn their heads. And when Catherine looked up, her face paled. Catherine's grip on her phone tightened. The man standing before her wasn't a waiter. He wasn't a manager. He didn't wear an apron or carry a tray. He was dressed in a crisp charcoal suit, the kind that fit too well to be off the rack. No name tag, no clipboard, just presence. The kind of presence that didn't demand attention, but commanded it anyway. She swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. "Is there a problem here?" he repeated, his voice smooth but firm. Catherine's eyes darted to his face, studying him in a way she hadn't bothered to with Daniel. There was something familiar about him, a shape to his features, a certain way he held himself, but she couldn't place it. She straightened in her seat, masking whatever flicker of uncertainty had just crossed her mind. "I expect a certain level of service when I dine out," she said, her voice measured. "Your waiter doesn't seem to understand that." The man glanced at Daniel, then back at her. His expression didn't change. "I see." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. And what exactly was the issue? Catherine blinked. She wasn't used to this. She was used to managers apologizing, offering free desserts, falling over themselves to make things right. She set her phone down, her posture stiff. "The water was warm, and I don't appreciate being argued with by the staff. When I make a request, I expect it to be fulfilled." Silence. The man tilted his head slightly, his eyes sharp but unreadable. Then, slowly, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Tell me, Catherine," he said, voice quieter now. "Do you remember me?" It hit like a slap. The casual way he said her name, like he had every right to it, like they weren't strangers at all. Her pulse kicked up. "Should I?" she asked, her tone clipped. He let the question sit between them for a beat too long. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he unfastened his watch, rolling up his sleeves. And Catherine's breath caught in her throat. Because now, she remembered, the scar on his left forearm, a faint line, barely visible but unmistakable. Catherine's mind reeled, trying to place it, trying to push past the years, the decades, the carefully curated distance between her past and present. And then, like ice water spilling down her spine, it hit her. Nathan. The name left her lips before she could stop it. A slow smile, humorless. Close. He adjusted his cuff. "Nathan was my business partner, my best friend. The man who built Langley Enterprises with your husband, before he was forced out." Catherine's stomach twisted. She knew the story. Knew it well. Nathan Richards. Brilliant. Calculated. Driven. Her husband, Charles, had admired him, trusted him, built an empire alongside him. But when the company took off, when the real money started rolling in, things changed. Nathan had been edged out, contracts rewritten, promises broken. Charles always framed it as just business, a necessary move. Catherine never questioned it. She didn't ask about the details, didn't concern herself with who was left behind. And Nathan had disappeared. Until now. Except he hadn't disappeared. He had rebuilt. Her throat felt tight. I didn't realize." "Of course you didn't." His voice was still even, but there was an edge to it now. "You never had to. While you were climbing the social ladder, my family was starting over, from scratch, without the company we helped build. Without the wealth your husband secured by shutting us out. A sharp silence settled between them. Catherine forced a breath, forcing composure. I had nothing to do with that, she said, though even to her own ears it sounded weak. Nathan, not Nathan, Malcolm. Malcolm Reed studied her, the way someone examines an old wound, deciding if it still hurts. Didn't you? He asked. You enjoyed the benefits, didn't you? The money, the lifestyle, and you never asked where it all came from. Never wondered what happened to the people your husband stepped over to get there. Catherine's jaw clenched. That's not fair. For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed Malcolm's face. A quiet amusement, almost pitying. Fair. He shook his head. That's a word people like you only use when the rules aren't working in your favor. And for the first time in her life, Catherine Langley had no words. Catherine's fingers curled around the linen napkin in her lap, gripping it as if it could anchor her. She wasn't used to this, being on the receiving end of scrutiny, of judgment. She had spent her life around powerful men, around people who dictated the course of things, people who made decisions that rippled through others' lives without a second thought. But now, sitting across from Malcolm Reed, she felt something unfamiliar, something she refused to name. I came here for dinner, she said, her voice clipped, controlled. Not a history lesson. Malcolm exhaled, a quiet chuckle beneath his breath. He leaned back, regarding her with something that wasn't quite anger, but wasn't kindness either. You think this is about history? His voice was calm. This isn't history, Catherine. It's your present. Right now, in this moment, you are exactly who you've always been. The same woman who could sit at the top and never question how she got there. The same woman who can look a man in the face and decide in an instant that he is beneath her. Catherine's lips pressed into a thin line. You're twisting this into something it isn't. Am I? Malcolm's eyes held hers, unwavering. Tell me, what exactly made you decide Daniel wasn't experienced enough? Was it his posture? His service? Or was it something else? The accusation landed like a slap. Her pulse picked up, heat crawling up her neck. I don't have to explain myself to you. No, he agreed, nodding slightly. You don't. A pause. But for the first time, someone is asking you to. The words hung between them, heavier than anything else that had been said. For the first time, Catherine could feel the weight of eyes on her. Not just Malcolm's, the entire restaurant. The people who had witnessed everything, who had seen her. For so many years, she had controlled the rooms she walked into, dictated the energy, determined who was worthy of respect and who wasn't. But tonight, she wasn't the one in control, and that realization settled into her chest like a stone. But the lesson wasn't over yet. The weight of the moment sat heavy between them, stretching the silence in a way that made Catherine's skin prickle. She could feel it, the unspoken shift. She wasn't the most important person in the room anymore. For the first time, she wasn't even in control of the conversation. She reached for her water glass, more to give her hands something to do than out of thirst. The liquid swirled slightly as she lifted it, her grip a little too tight. She took a sip, forcing herself to hold Malcolm's gaze, as if that might somehow re-establish the balance of power. It didn't. Malcolm was relaxed in his chair, one arm resting on the table, his expression unreadable but completely steady. He wasn't rattled. He wasn't emotional. He was in command. You're looking for a way out of this, he observed, tilting his head slightly, a way to reset the moment, to pretend it never happened. Catherine exhaled sharply. I don't have to sit here and be lectured. Then don't. Malcolm gestured toward the restaurant. You're free to leave. No one's stopping you. Her jaw tightened. He was right, of course. She could stand up, gather her things and walk out. The valet would bring her car, and in 20 minutes she'd be back in her apartment with its floor-to-ceiling windows and curated perfection. And yet, she didn't move, because if she left now, she knew what the story would be. The wealthy woman who stormed out after being challenged. The one who didn't have a response when finally confronted with something real. The thought made her stomach churn. So instead, She did what she had always done. She deflected. "You seem to have done well for yourself," she said, forcing her voice into something measured. "Owning a place like this. Impressive." Malcolm let out a quiet breath of laughter, shaking his head. "You're still doing it," he said. "Still trying to reframe things so you don't have to sit in discomfort." Catherine stiffened. "But I'll give you credit," he continued, his voice even. "At least you're still sitting here. That's more than I expected." Her fingers twitched against the napkin in her lap, but she didn't respond. Because, for once, she had nothing to say. The air in the restaurant felt heavier now, charged with something unspoken. Catherine wasn't sure if it was the weight of Malcolm's presence or the realization pressing down on her like an unseen force. For years she had walked into places like this expecting a certain kind of treatment, a certain level of deference. She had built her world on assumptions, about power, about wealth, about who mattered. Tonight those assumptions had been shattered. She exhaled slowly, setting her glass down with deliberate care. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Malcolm's expression didn't change. "I don't want anything from you, Catherine." He leaned forward slightly. "This isn't about me. It never was." She frowned, gripping the edge of the table. "Then what is it about?" Malcolm studied her for a long moment before speaking. "It's about whether, for the first time in your life, you're willing to see yourself the way the rest of the world does." Silence. A slow, sinking sensation settled in Catherine's stomach. Because deep down, she already knew the answer. She had spent a lifetime avoiding mirrors like this. The kind that didn't just reflect back what she wanted to see, but what was actually there. And Malcolm. He had just forced her to look. The waiter, Daniel, passed by their table. Catherine glanced at him briefly. Really looked at him this time, not as a fixture in the background, not as someone to serve her, but as a person. The realization tasted bitter. Malcolm pushed his chair back and stood, adjusting his sleeve. "Enjoy your meal," he said simply. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Catherine sitting there, alone with her thoughts. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing against her chest, the finality of it, the uncomfortable truth she couldn't escape. For the first time, she wasn't sure what to do next, and maybe that was the beginning of something real. Sometimes, the most powerful lessons aren't the ones we seek out. They're the ones that find us when we least expect them. Catherine walked into that restaurant certain of her place in the world, but by the time she left, she wasn't so sure anymore. How often do we move through life without questioning the impact of our words, our actions, our assumptions? How many times have we ignored the discomfort of reflection because it's easier to pretend we have nothing to learn? Maybe it's time we all take a moment to look in that mirror. If this story made you think, if it stirred something in you, then share it. Talk about it. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. Because sometimes the hardest truths are the ones that push us toward change.